John, let's go on and get ourselves another contestant.
All right, Bob, how about Nancy Heimstra? Come on down. You're the next contestant on The Price is Right.
$600.
$600 is her bid. Lois?
$480.
$480 brings me to Mitchell.
$490.
$490, and we're back to Tilly. $450. And the actual retail price is...
for this year for spodumene as well as carbonate and hydroxide, and also kind of medium to long term.
When we look at the sort of long-run incentive price in the lithium market, I think we still see, spodumene is going to be close to that sort of $600 mark from where we are today is in and around $450 now. So you are going to have to see some elevation in prices there to support some of these new projects. Similarly on the, in the chemical front, and I can't give you the exact number off the top of my head, but we're around the 12 to low teens level in terms of a long-run incentive price to support those. So maybe not as high as 14, but I think we're still, like I say, in the low teens as a long-run incentive for the chemicals. So that's where we are, and compared to where we are today, we're at about, roughly on average around $10 for hydroxide, depending on which part of the world. It obviously dragged down a lot by the low prices in China, but those have become a bit more robust in the past few weeks. On the chemical side, like I say, again, we're seeing more stable pricing compared to where Q4 was, with some incredibly low offers in the Chinese market, and you're still seeing prices in around the 8 level. So there does have to be some elevation from where we are today, we believe, to support further expansions.
Welcome to Lithium-ion Rocks, episode 28. It is Saturday, March 7th. I'm here after a couple of days at PDAC earlier this week, and that was Andy Miller, who joined us 12 months ago for our first The Price is Right episode. We figured we'd revisit that, which also coincided with SQM's results, which we're going to talk about here. We have Rodney going to comment as well. He wrote a note for our proprietary Patreon subscribers, which we would encourage all of you to sign up for if you want to get this proprietary insight, of which he gives some snippet here, as well as some of our GLG customers. Rodney has been heavily focused on Europe and is chairing a flagship, a new benchmark event in Berlin this June. But before that, benchmark is going to be in Washington again for their major kind of U.S.-focused critical minerals for the battery supply chain, which Andy gave a snippet of at the start of his presentation at the Miller-Thomson event. But before we go to Rodney and to Andy, we're going to have a little bit of a snippet here from Nobel Prize winner Stanley Whittingham, who was the keynote at this Miller-Thomson event.
You saw a lithium-ion battery go into an electric vehicle in 1977, and until the late 2000s, there were no lithium-powered cars driving around. So 40 years it took. And I just wanted to maybe hear your perspective on how technologies move, and this one being a really good example of this slow, steady growth, and then all of a sudden you have that accelerated movement into it, and maybe what the catalyst was in your mind for that movement.
There were several catalysts, and can I say anti-catalysts? So remember when Exxon got involved in lithium-ion batteries, gasoline was in the US 25 cents a gallon. They perceived oil production was going to peak about the year 2000, so they wanted to become an energy company. In the mid-80s, well, I should say in the 70s, the gas prices went up because of the Arab embargo. They then came down again, and the batteries weren't really ready then. It was really the build-up in Japan for electronic devices, small ones. You test them as they get larger and larger, and then it really became viable 20, 30 years later. Remember, all vehicles in 1900 were electric. So it went to electric, internal combustion engines, tossed them out. They're now coming back again. And I think part of the change you're going to see is political decisions, that we are going to go to a cleaner environment. You're not going to drive diesel engines in downtown Toronto anymore. You're going to have clean engines, and that's clearly happening in London. They're trying to make it happen in New York, and it's happening in San Francisco. So a lot of this is going to be politics-driven. But clearly, I was in California last week, and I don't want to say every third car was a Tesla, but it seemed like that. So clearly they're taking off, and the Tesla 3 is sold more cars than any other car except for 3, I think. So it's beating most of the compact cars sold by the major companies, including Toyota. So the environment is right. Electric vehicles are going to take over. And it's clear that utilities want to get rid of all their peaker stations because it's huge capital investment. And if they can use batteries to do that, they're going to do it. Solar these days is cheaper than putting in a new coal power plant.
Most forecasts for lithium specifically kind of downplay that lithium is going to be the winner in grid storage. You seem to have a different opinion. Could you just talk about that and compare it to other technologies? And also, does the U.S. have a bit of a lead in grid storage relative to China and other countries?
Right now, most of the companies are using exactly the same technologies for the vehicles. The composition of the NMC may be slightly different. Certainly some of the grid storage efforts in the US have been using lithium iron phosphate. I wouldn't necessarily say US is ahead. They have a fairly large number of grid storage efforts. Los Angeles apparently has given the go-ahead to build a 1 gigawatt hour lithium battery grid storage facility. Clearly places like Australia, where electricity can cost over $1 a kilowatt hour, they're putting grid storage in, and that's what Tesla did in South Australia. A lot of the grid storage batteries are built in South Korea by LG, and they've been having a few issues of late. But there's a very large push in this country to get grid storage online. Germany has to do the same thing because they've got more renewables than the grid can handle. So I think it's going to happen across the board, and there's not going to be any one country on top of it.
NCMA versus the current NCM cathode technology, what that means in terms of both performance and cost.
So this is what the Battery 500 Consortium in the United States is looking at. This is led by Pacific National Lab. NMCA just means that we think they'll all have some aluminum in them, that's the A, or magnesium or something like that to stabilize them. We've shifted from 622 to 811, and my colleagues in Texas are now over 90% nickel. The issue is as soon as you get much above 60%, they're very air sensitive, so the materials have to be handled in a dry room or some similar environment, and so they can be more difficult to ship. But the tendency is to go to 811, and if we can do it even higher. 811 is very similar to NCA, except 811 has a bit of manganese in it. My colleagues at BASF are going the opposite way. They want to go to very high manganese to cut down the costs. It's not clear whether that's going to work, but they're investing millions of dollars into doing that. So all the large efforts here and in Europe are all looking at what is the best composition for the NMCA, and that to some extent depends on the electrolyte. If we can come up with a new electrolyte that's stable to these higher nickel materials, then it will go higher and higher in nickel.
I gave a long interview with INN, Priscilla Barrera, at the PDAC, which I would encourage you all to listen to, which talks a lot about my stock ideas and repositioning of portfolio in the light of coronavirus and just other things we're seeing in the market. But I'll quickly comment on some takeaways and learnings we heard. I haven't seen this publicly disclosed in English, but Tianqi put out a press release in Chinese about 2 weeks ago talking about their stage 1 Kwinana, having yet another cost overrun. I think of maybe $100 million, and that's being slowed down. So they are having their own operational problems, far worse, it seems, than anything, Namaska undertook. Unfortunately, Namaska has gone bankrupt. Best wishes to Guy Bourassa, who stepped down, and they are now in a kind of a bankruptcy process. I know a number of companies and investors are in receipt of, the pitch book and teasers. We interviewed John Hikeway, who is involved a bit in Namaska and the Orion transaction, and that will be a subsequent podcast I encourage you to tune into after this one. All the majors, SQM, Albemarle, and Livent, as well as Orocobre, reported their results. My sense from Albemarle and Livent was that I was just surprised, given this is an oligopolistic industry, how little pricing power both of them had with big reductions. I just don't understand why they can't tell their purchasers who clearly are going to need their ramp up of activity that I'm sorry, we're not going to lower the price as much as we did. But this is a dynamic market, and in a few years' time, I believe that the pricing power will be with more of the suppliers if and when they're able to produce the quality, which I don't believe SQM does at the moment. Livent's earnings are being hurt by having to purchase third-party carbonates, so their margins have been squeezed. My leading indicator, Ganfeng, I sold that stock because it is now the most highly valued company in the lithium space. But their margins have shrunk to 9%. I mean, they really suffer from purchasing higher cost spodumene from a well negotiated offtake agreement by Mineral Resources and Neometals side. We just had SQM report yet again, no increase in supply over the previous year. So the air supply narrative has been debunked. What also came from SQM's quarterly call was that lithium demand was 14% up last year, and that compared to their forecast of 20% demand increase. So everyone talks about oversupply. I talk about under demand, in particular from China, in particular because of the collapsed subsidies in the second half of the year, which may or may not have been influenced by the trade war, but the trade war certainly influenced corporate liquidity within China and the ability of converters to, fully ramp up. These are second-tier converters, ramp up their capacity, and also some battery companies. I make some final comments at the end of this podcast after Andy and Rodney's segment, but the last thing for me for now is some comment on a company I have great respect for, and that is Altura. Congratulations to James Brown and Altura. I know a lot of people continue to pay disrespect to that company and blame the company for self-inflicted wounds and the like, and not having great offtake. But hindsight is 2020, and the reality is their offtake partner wrote a $40 million check, JNR Optimum Nano, in 2017. Who thought they'd go bankrupt? Who thought the slowdown would be as material? In China, you have even Ganfeng is an offtake partner of Pilbara, but decided not to participate in Pilbara's rights offer. Instead, CATL came in. So there's a lot of dynamism and moving around, in the market. But I was significantly involved with Altura and that financing on both the debt and equity side. They had a floor of $550, and a ceiling of $950 for their spodumene. They've executed nearly flawlessly, except for a $20 million, operational overrun. But they have just been kicked in the teeth by this under demand, less so oversupply. They have very high quality, and a lot of people have been rooting for them to follow, Bald Hill over. But hats off to Alan Buckler, very wealthy chairman of the company, who has continued to follow his money into it. They did have to revise their debt agreements and give some sweeteners in terms of options and stock, and there is now this kind of $50 million equity line out there that they can tap into, and hopefully they don't need too much because it's a bit of an overhang, but it was a painful financing Congratulations to Clarkson, who is also the co-lead with National Bank Financial on the Namaska process, but they did package and structure and source alternative capital, that has kept Altura, in business. Hopefully, there'll be a turn sooner rather than later so that the spodumene prices will uplift and they can make some cash flow, and pay their interest. But coronavirus, yet another kick in the teeth that nobody could forecast. So again, to those who continue to pay disrespect or say that like only GAN, all of the Western Australians were kind of idiots for trying to get into production without solid offtake agreements. The reality is there are very few converters in China of high quality. Ganfeng is one. The market in 2016, 2017, which was demand was here as far as the eye can see, and you have a whole bunch of small and mid-size, second tier, but nevertheless ambitious entrepreneurial converters and battery companies, and who's to say, when they're writing a check and it goes in your bank for $40 million, that they're not going to be in business, 6 months later, as was the case with Altura. Meantime, Altura, and their sales force, hats off to Alex Cheeseman, for sourcing new customers. I think they'll be well positioned if they, seem to be, surviving through this crisis. What'll happen to the stock, I don't know near term until we see an uptick in spodumene prices. I would be, very cautious, but just from a pure operations perspective, I'm a fan of the team at Altura as I am at Pilbara, and I wish them the greatest success, and I believe that their product will be needed in this market for many, many years to come. But I still remain a bigger fan of vertically integrated strategies as opposed to just spodumene only stories. I have some questions from Rodney here. He unfortunately couldn't be at PDAC. What are your thoughts on the impact of the coronavirus on lithium supply in China? So that's supply, and also on the demand impact. There was some chemical inventory from last year, but EV sales are weak for January and February in China. They've been pretty good in Europe. So what's your sense?
I think for the time being, and you really do in the short term sort of have to look at where the major operations, a lot of the smaller converters in China at the tail end of last year because of the market conditions weren't producing, some at all anyway at that point in the market. So you really have to focus on where the major operators are. What we're hearing at the moment is the biggest disruption is really around logistics. I think they're not quite operating at capacity, the major producers, the tier one producers in the market, but they're moving towards that, and we haven't heard of any disruption to deliveries at this stage. So I think in the short term, focus on those smaller group of Chinese producers that are producing battery grade material. At the moment, it doesn't seem there's too much disruption to their production, but it's one we're tracking closely. And if there's some disruption to logistics, particularly where China's very dominant, particularly on the lithium hydroxide front, for instance, that can always have a knock-on impact in the market. I think longer term, and the longer term concern around coronavirus potentially becomes, as you're working through that backlog that we have of this spodumene concentrate in the market, how quickly is that going to be absorbed? And if some of those smaller operators aren't coming back into the market or aren't coming back in and producing at the scale that expected in the first half of this year, does this push back the backlog in the supply chain? And are we sort of held under current market conditions for a little bit longer? I think that's the bigger question. But at the moment it is very much, we're waiting to see. We haven't heard of too much disruption on the production side of things, but or the deliveries at this stage. But it's one we're monitoring very closely.
Tianqi announced in Chinese about 2 weeks ago that Kwinana Stage 1 had a cost overrun. Could you talk about what you know of Tianqi and what this means for Northvolt and the other customers that they had from that? Because that's a lot of hydroxide supply that's going to be delayed. Your conclusion of your presentations were expect more volatility.